The alarm screams in total darkness, and Marek's eyes open to a world that has never known sunlight. He is 14 years old, and he has been awake for 90 minutes out of every 24 hours of his entire life because sleep is a luxury the poor cannot afford. This is what it means to be poor in Warhammer 40K, where your life is measured not in years of joy but in shifts of survival, where your value is calculated not in human worth but in production quotas, and where your death will matter to no one except the other desperate souls who share your darkness. Welcome to the bottom of the hive, where billions of human beings exist in conditions that would kill a noble in minutes, where every breath burns your lungs and every day brings you closer to a death that no one will remember. Marek reaches out in the blackness and finds the wall of his hab unit exactly where it has always been. 2 meters from his sleeping mat in one direction, 2 meters in the other. This is his entire world, a space so small that he can touch both walls at once if he stretches his arms wide. A room he shares with his mother and his younger sister Vera, who sleeps curled against the far corner. The air is thick and hot, carrying the smell of unwashed bodies, industrial chemicals, and the ever-present stink of the recycling processors that turn human waste into something the Imperium claims is clean water. He has breathed this air since the moment he was born in this same hab unit 14 years ago, and it has already scarred his lungs with black deposits that show up in the occasional medical scan the overseers order tech adepts to perform to ensure workers remain productive. The alarm continues its harsh mechanical scream, a sound designed not to wake gently but to shock the body into immediate action. It is the third shift bell, which means Marek has exactly 6 minutes to reach the factorum floor or face execution for dereliction of duty. 6 minutes to move from sleep to full productivity, 6 minutes to transition from human being to productive component in the vast machine of imperial industry. There is no time for washing, no time for bathroom needs, no time for the basic dignities that nobles take for granted. There is only the bell and the consequences of ignoring it. Marek pulls himself to his feet in the darkness, his movements automatic after years of identical mornings. His hands find his work clothes by touch alone, the rough fabric stiff with dried sweat and chemical residue from yesterday's shift. And the shift before that, and the shift before that. He has owned these same clothes for 3 years, and they will remain his only clothes until they literally fall apart on his body, at which point the factorum will issue him new ones and deduct the cost from his wages for the next 6 months. His fingers button the shirt without thought, tie the boots without seeing, adjust the belt that holds his ration card and identification number. The ration card is everything. Without it, you do not exist in the eyes of the Imperium. With it, you are entitled to your daily allotment of food and water, calculated by tech priests to provide the absolute minimum nutrition necessary to keep a human body functioning at productive capacity. Marek's daily water ration is 1.7 liters, delivered in recycled containers that still smell of the chemicals used to purify wastewater into something technically drinkable. The water tastes of metal and bleach and things he has no names for, but it is water, and water is life, and he drinks every drop because there is never enough to satisfy actual thirst. His food ration sits waiting on the small shelf that serves as their kitchen, dining room, and storage space. Corpse starch. 3 gray bars of compressed protein that look like industrial clay and taste like absolutely nothing because the rendering process destroys all flavor along with all evidence of what the protein used to be. Marek knows on some level that corpse starch is made from the dead, that the bodies of workers who died yesterday are processed and reformed and distributed as food for workers who will die tomorrow. Everyone knows this. No one speaks of it. What choice do they have? The Imperium recycles everything in the hive because resources are precious and human bodies are the most abundant resource of all. He eats 1 bar standing up in the darkness, chewing mechanically while his mind focuses on the counting that dominates his existence. 6 minutes to reach the factorum means he has perhaps 90 seconds to eat, 30 seconds to drink his morning water ration, and the remaining time to navigate the corridors between his hab unit and his workstation. The mathematics of poverty are precise and unforgiving. Every second has a purpose. Every moment serves survival. There is no time that belongs to him, no minutes he can waste on thoughts or dreams or the basic human desires that nobles satisfy without thinking. His mother is already gone, her sleeping mat empty and cold. She works the second shift in the textile mills, 16 hours of standing at looms that weave fabric for noble clothing from thread so fine it cuts unprotected fingers to the bone. She left 4 hours ago and will not return for another 12 hours, and when she does return, she will have exactly 4 hours to sleep before her shift begins again. Marek has not had a real conversation with his mother in 3 years because their shift schedules never align. Because exhaustion makes speech difficult. Because what is there to say that would change anything about their existence? Vera stirs in her corner and Marek hears the wet cough that has become constant over the past 6 months. The same cough their father had before he collapsed at his workstation 2 years ago, and was dragged away by servitors who processed his body into the same corpse starch Marek is eating right now. The same cough that every worker in the lower hive develops eventually as the toxic air destroys lung tissue one breath at a time. Vera is 9 years old, and Marek knows with the cold certainty of experience that she has maybe 2 years before the cough gets bad enough that she cannot work, and workers who cannot work do not receive rations, and people without rations die. He leaves his second ration bar next to her sleeping mat, a sacrifice that will leave him hungry throughout his shift but might give her a few more weeks of strength. This is love in the lower hive, expressed not through words or embraces but through the sharing of insufficient resources. The giving of what you cannot afford to give because the alternative is watching those you care about die slightly faster than you are dying yourself. The door to their hab unit opens onto a corridor that stretches into darkness in both directions, lined with identical doors behind which identical families face identical struggles. The corridor is 2 meters wide and designed to accommodate moderate foot traffic, but 300,000 people live in Hab Block 7 Delta 9, which was built to house $30,000, and so the corridor is always packed with bodies moving in desperate haste toward shift bells that never stop ringing. Marek steps into the flow of workers and is immediately swept along by the pressure of bodies behind him and beside him and in front of him, all moving in the same direction with the same urgency driven by the same fear. The noise in the corridor is overwhelming. Thousands of boots on metal floors create a sound like constant thunder. Thousands of voices raised in anger or fear or simple communication blend into a roar that makes individual words impossible to distinguish. Thousands of breathing bodies in a space with inadequate ventilation create heat that makes the already hot air feel like being inside an oven. Marek moves with the crowd because stopping would mean being trampled, because the flow of workers is like a river that crushes anything that tries to resist its current. He sees a woman fall 3 meters ahead of him, her legs giving out from exhaustion or hunger or the dozen medical conditions that plague workers who never receive actual medical care. The crowd does not stop. The crowd cannot stop. Bodies step on her and over her and around her, and her screams are lost in the general roar of noise. Marek pushes forward because he must, because stopping to help would mean missing his shift bell, because one death among billions is not remarkable enough to justify his own execution. He will not think about her later. He cannot afford to think about her later. Thinking about all the death you witness in the lower hive is a path to madness, and madness means inability to work, and inability to work means becoming another body trampled in another corridor. The crowd funnels toward the transit lifts, massive industrial elevators that carry workers from the hab blocks to the factorum levels in loads of 500 at a time. The lifts are old, their machinery maintained just barely enough to prevent total failure, their safety systems disabled decades ago because safety systems slow down throughput, and throughput is all that matters. Marek pushes into a lift car with 499 other workers packed so tightly that breathing becomes difficult, that movement becomes impossible, that individual bodies merge into a single mass of human flesh pressed together by necessity and economics. The lift descends, and Marak counts the levels as they pass. Hab levels, storage levels, processing levels, maintenance levels, each one identical to the last. Because the lower hive is a machine, and machines are built for function, not variety. The descent takes 4 minutes, 4 minutes of standing pressed against strangers who smell of sweat and chemicals and fear. 4 minutes of breathing air that has already been breathed by 499 other pairs of lungs. When the lift doors open on the factorum level, the crowd explodes outward with desperate speed because the shift bell waits for no one and late arrival means death. Marak runs with the others through corridors that glow with the red emergency lighting that provides the only illumination in the factorum. Not because there is an emergency, but because red lights are cheaper than white lights and the Imperium economizes on everything that serves the poor. His workstation is in Refinery Section 7, a space filled with massive tanks of promethium that must be processed and purified before being shipped to upper levels, where it will fuel vehicles and generators and the comfortable lives of people who will never know his name. He reaches his station with 40 seconds to spare, his chest burning from the sprint, his legs shaking from exhaustion that is already present before his shift even begins. The station is a valve assembly, a wheel of metal 1 meter in diameter connected to pipes that carry superheated promethium from the storage tanks to the refining systems. His job is simple in description but maddening in execution. He must turn the wheel exactly 47 times clockwise every 3 minutes for the entire 16-hour shift. Not 46 times, not 48 times. Exactly 47. The counting is enforced by overseers who walk the factorum floor with shock mauls and data slates that track every worker's output. Deviation from the prescribed number means punishment. Repeated deviation means servitorization, the process of removing your brain and replacing it with machinery that will never make counting errors again. The shift bell rings its final warning and Marak's hands close around the valve wheel. The metal is already hot from the promethium flowing through the pipes beneath. Hot enough that prolonged contact will burn his palms, but work gloves are not provided because work gloves cost money and worker hands are free to replace. He begins to turn, counting in his head, his entire consciousness narrowing to the numbers that will define the next 16 hours of his existence. 1, 2, 3, 4. The wheel resists, requiring real strength to move, and by turn 20 his arms are already aching. 5, 6, 7, 8. By turn 30 sweat is dripping into his eyes. 9, 10, 11, 12. By turn 47 his shoulders are burning, but he has 2 minutes and 20 seconds to rest before he must begin the sequence again. Around him, thousands of other workers perform their own repetitive tasks in the red glow of emergency lighting. A woman operates a press that stamps components 83 times per minute. A man monitors a gauge and adjusts a lever whenever the needle enters the red zone, which happens every 47 seconds. A child no older than Vera crawls through a pipe too small for adult bodies, scraping away chemical buildup with a wire brush that will eventually poison her blood. This is the factorum, the engine of production that generates the wealth that flows upward through the hive until it reaches the noble spires where it becomes silk and wine and jewelry and all the beautiful things that Marak will never see. The temperature in the refinery section is 50 degrees Celsius, maintained by the heat of the promethium and the inadequate ventilation that allows hot air to accumulate. Workers die of heat stroke regularly, their bodies dragged away during shift changes, their positions filled immediately by others desperate for work. Marak drinks from his water ration sparingly, knowing that 1.7 liters must last the entire shift, that running out means enduring the heat with a dry mouth and a desperate thirst that makes the hours feel even longer. 3 minutes pass, and he begins turning again. 47 times, his mind counting automatically now. His body moving through motions that have become as natural as breathing. This is his life. This is the life of the poor in Warhammer 40K. Not a life interrupted by work, but work interrupted by brief moments of survival. The valve wheel completes its 47th rotation, and Marek releases his grip with hands that have already developed blisters from the heat of the metal. He has been turning the wheel for 3 hours now, which means he has completed it 60 times, which means he has 13 more hours to go before his shift ends. The mathematics are simple and brutal. 16 hours multiplied by 20 turns per hour equals 320 complete cycles of counting to 47. His mind will perform this calculation 320 times today, just as it performed it 320 times yesterday, just as it will perform it 320 times tomorrow. The repetition is not accidental, the repetition is the point. The Imperium teaches that repetitive labor is holy, that the surrender of individual thought to mechanical routine brings the worker closer to the purity of the machine, that suffering through monotonous toil glorifies the Emperor and serves humanity's divine mission. Marek has heard these sermons every rest day since he was old enough to understand words. The preachers speak of blessed labor and sacred duty, of workers as the foundation upon which the Imperium stands, of poverty as a test of faith that the worthy endure with gratitude. The words are supposed to bring comfort, supposed to make the endless repetition feel meaningful, supposed to transform suffering into purpose. But Marek's hands are burning from the hot metal of the valve wheel, and his shoulders are screaming from the constant motion, and his mind is slowly going numb from counting the same numbers over and over and over. There is no glory in this that he can feel, no holiness that makes the pain easier to bear, no divine purpose that explains why turning a wheel 47 times every 3 minutes for 16 hours straight serves the Emperor better than any other possible arrangement of human activity. There is only the wheel and the counting and the knowledge that stopping means death. To his left, 3 meters away, stands Jack. He is 16 years old and has worked the refinery for 2 years, which makes him a veteran by lower hive standards where most workers die or are disabled within 5 years of starting factorum labor. Jack works a different valve system, one that requires turning a smaller wheel 63 times every 4 minutes. They became friends during shift overlap periods when their rest intervals coincided, sharing the few words that exhaustion and overseer surveillance allowed. Jack taught Marek how to pace his breathing to reduce fatigue, how to shift his grip on the wheel to prevent the worst blisters, how to think about nothing at all while counting so that the hours pass in a blur of mechanical motion rather than conscious suffering. The friendship is real despite existing entirely within the context of shared labor. They have never met outside the factorum, never shared a meal or a conversation that lasted longer than the 2-minute rest periods allowed between valve cycles. Marek does not know where Jack lives or whether he has family or what he dreams about during the 90 minutes of daily sleep their schedules permit. But he knows that Jack's presence 3 meters to his left makes the shift slightly more bearable, that having another human being who acknowledges your existence matters even when that acknowledgement consists of nothing more than a nod of recognition across the space between workstations. The temperature continues to rise as the shift progresses and more workers arrive and more machinery activates and more promethium flows through the pipes that run beneath the factorum floor. By hour 4, the air itself seems to shimmer with heat, and Marek's work clothes are soaked completely through with sweat that drips onto the metal floor and evaporates almost instantly. His water ration is half gone, and he forces himself to take smaller sips, knowing that running out before the shift ends means hours of thirst so intense it makes thinking difficult. Around him, other workers show signs of heat stress. A woman sways at her station, catching herself before falling. A man vomits onto the floor but continues working because stopping would mean the shock maul. The overseers watch, everything from their elevated platforms, their uniforms clean and dry, their own water rations unlimited because they serve a supervisory function that the Imperium values more highly than actual production. The promethium pipes run everywhere through the refinery section, a maze of metal arteries carrying chemical fire from the storage tanks to the processing equipment. The pipes are old, their seals degraded by decades of use and minimal maintenance, their metal walls thinned by chemical corrosion that happens slowly but never stops. Leak detection systems exist, but they are expensive to maintain, and the Factorum managers economize wherever possible because their bonuses are calculated based on profit margins, not worker safety. Small leaks are common, releasing vapor into the air that burns the lungs and causes the headaches that plague every refinery worker. Large leaks are rare but catastrophic, and Marek has seen 3 major Promethium releases during his 2 years in the Factorum. The first killed 12 workers in Section 4 when a corroded pipe burst and sprayed chemical fire across their workstations. The second released toxic vapor that suffocated 30 people in Section 9 before ventilation systems cleared the air. The third happened in Section 11 and killed only 5 people, which the overseers classified as a minor incident not worthy of work stoppage. Each time, the bodies were removed during shift changes, the damaged equipment was repaired with the cheapest possible materials, and production resumed as though nothing had happened. The Imperium does not stop the machine for funerals or mourning, or the recognition that human beings have died. The machine exists to produce, and production must never stop, and workers who die are simply replaced by other workers who need work because not working means not eating. Marek completes another cycle and begins again, his hands finding the wheel automatically, his arms beginning the motion that has become as natural as breathing. Turn 1, turn 2, turn 3. The counting fills his mind, pushing out thoughts of heat and thirst and pain. This is the mercy of repetitive labor, that it eventually numbs the mind as thoroughly as it exhausts the body. That consciousness itself can be reduced to nothing but numbers and motion. Turn 15, turn 16, turn 17. He is not Marek anymore. He is not a person with hopes or fears or desires. He is a component in the machine, a living tool that turns valves, a biological mechanism that counts to 47. The explosion happens without warning at hour 7 of the shift. One moment the Factorum is filled with the normal sounds of industrial production, the hiss of promethium through pipes and the clank of machinery and the shuffle of worker feet on metal floors. The next moment there is a sound like reality tearing, a noise so loud it physically hurts, and then the screaming begins. Section 6, 2 sections over from where Marek stands, has experienced a catastrophic pipe failure. The promethium line that runs along the ceiling has ruptured completely, and chemical fire is spraying across the work floor in a stream of liquid flame. Workers are burning, their bodies transformed into torches that run and scream and fall. The smell hits Marek immediately, the chemical stink of promethium mixed with the horrible odor of burning human flesh. He can see the flames from his position, can see the people trying to escape, can see the fire spreading as the promethium splashes across metal surfaces and ignites everything it touches. Jack is closer to the rupture, only 1 section away, and Marek watches in frozen horror as his friend is caught by the edge of the promethium spray. The chemicals hit Jack's left side, igniting his work clothes instantly, and suddenly Jack is on fire and screaming and trying to beat out the flames with his hands. The fire does not stop. Promethium burns hotter than normal fire, hot enough to melt metal, hot enough to consume human flesh in seconds. Jack's screams are the worst sound Marek has ever heard, worse than any nightmare, worse than anything his imagination could have created. They are the sound of a human being burning alive, of pain so intense it destroys sanity, of death approaching with terrible slowness. Marek takes 1 step toward his friend before a shock maul slams into his back, driving him to his knees. An overseer stands above him, the maul raised for another strike. The overseer's voice is cold and mechanical as he delivers the instruction that defines the Imperium's relationship to worker lives. Return to your station. Production continues. Around the burning section, other workers are receiving the same instruction. delivered with shockmalls and shouted commands and the immediate violence that enforces compliance. The overseers are not evacuating the factorum. They are not stopping production. They are redirecting workers around the catastrophe, maintaining the flow of labor while the fire consumes those unlucky enough to be caught in its path. Marak crawls back to his valve station, his back burning from the mall strike, his mind unable to process what he is seeing. Jack is still screaming, but the screams are weaker now, and then they stop. The body that was his friend continues to burn, adding its smoke to the chemical haze that fills the factorum air. 7 workers are dead or dying in the flames. 7 human lives ended in seconds because a pipe that should have been replaced years ago was maintained just barely enough to keep functioning until it did not. The cost of replacing that pipe would have been perhaps 1,000 throne geld. The cost of the jewelry that Lady Cassara wore to dinner in the script that came before this one was 500,000 throne geld. The mathematics of the Imperium's priorities are clear. Noble comfort matters. Worker lives do not. Production continues around the burning section. Workers turn their valves and operate their presses and monitor their gauges, while the smell of burning flesh fills their lungs and the screams of the dying echo through the refinery. This is normal. This is acceptable. This is the cost of production, paid in bodies that the Imperium replaces as easily as it replaces broken tools. Marak's hands find the valve wheel and he begins to turn even though his mind is screaming, even though tears are running down his face, even though everything inside him wants to stop working and help the people who are burning. But there is no helping them. There is only the wheel and the counting and the certain knowledge that stopping means joining them in death. Turn 1, turn 2, turn 3, his friend is dead. Turn 12, turn 13, turn 14. The body is still burning. Turn 23, turn 24, turn 25. The overseers are making notes on their data slates, calculating the production loss, determining how many replacement workers will be needed. Turn 34, turn 35, turn 36. The fire is being contained now, not by safety systems, but by the simple fact that there is nothing left to burn. Turn 45, turn 46, turn 47, cycle complete. 2 minutes and 20 seconds until the next cycle begins. Marak uses those seconds to vomit onto the floor, his body rejecting the corpse starch he ate this morning, his stomach heaving even though there is almost nothing to bring up. An overseer sees this and makes a mark on his data slate. Vomiting during work hours is classified as a productivity loss. 3 productivity losses in a single month period result in reduced rations. Marak has now accumulated 2 losses this month. He wipes his mouth and returns to the valve wheel because the alternative is accumulating a 3rd loss, and reduced rations for a family that is already slowly starving means Vera dies faster. The cleanup begins during the shift change, when new workers arrive to replace those completing their 16 hours. Servitors drag the burned bodies away, their mechanical limbs handling the charred remains with the same efficiency they use for any other waste removal task. The burned section of floor is scraped clean of residue. The damaged pipes are sealed with quick-setting compound that will last perhaps 6 months before failing, and new workers are directed to the stations that have been emptied by death. The entire process takes 40 minutes. By the start of the next full shift cycle, it will be as though the catastrophe never happened. No memorial, no moment of silence, no acknowledgement that 7 human beings ceased to exist. Just production resuming at normal levels with replacement components installed. Marak works the remaining 9 hours of his shift in a state of numb shock, his mind unable to fully process what he has witnessed. His hands turn the valve automatically. His lips count the rotations without conscious thought. His body performs its function while his consciousness retreats to some distant place where the horror cannot quite reach him. This is a survival mechanism that every lower hive worker develops eventually, the ability to separate mind from body, to observe suffering without feeling it fully, to witness death without allowing it to destroy your ability to continue functioning. The other workers around him show the same blank expressions. The same mechanical movements, the same retreat into numbness. They have all seen people die in industrial accidents. They have all lost friends and family members to the casual violence of factorum work. They have all learned that emotional response to death is a luxury they cannot afford, that grief requires energy they do not have, that mourning takes time that belongs to production. So they work through the trauma, they function through the horror, they survive by becoming slightly less human with each catastrophe they witness. The doctrine of the Imperium supports this dehumanization, encourages it, sanctifies it as holy purpose. The preachers teach that individual lives matter less than collective survival. That personal suffering serves the greater good of humanity's war against chaos and Xenos threats. That workers who die in service to production are martyrs whose sacrifice glorifies the Emperor. The sermons never mention that the production serves primarily to enrich nobles, that the wealth generated by worker suffering flows upward to purchase luxuries rather than outward to fund humanity's defense, that the system is designed not to protect humanity but to protect the privilege of those who rule. Marak has heard these sermons his entire life, has been taught from birth that his poverty is blessed and his suffering is holy, and his obedience is the highest virtue a human can demonstrate. He wants to believe because belief would make the pain easier to bear, would transform meaningless suffering into purposeful sacrifice, would give his friend's death some significance beyond being a line item in a production report. But his hands are still blistered from the hot valve wheel, and his lungs are still burning from the chemical smoke, and his mind can still hear Jack's screams echoing through his memory. The doctrine promises meaning, but the reality delivers only pain. The shift bell finally rings at hour 16, releasing Marak from his station. His legs barely support his weight as he walks away from the valve assembly, his body so exhausted that each step requires conscious effort. Around him, thousands of other workers shuffle toward the exits, their movements slow and pained, their faces blank with the fatigue that comes from 16 hours of repetitive labor in extreme heat. They do not speak to each other. They do not have the energy for speech. They simply move together like a river of exhausted humanity, flowing toward the transit lifts that will carry them back to their hab blocks for the 90 minutes of rest before the next shift begins. The transit lift is as packed as it was this morning. Bodies pressed together in the desperate crush of workers trying to return home. Marak stands, squeezed between strangers, breathing air that has already been breathed by hundreds of others. His mind still numb from witnessing his friend's death. The lift rises through the levels of the hive, carrying its cargo of exhausted workers toward the darkness of the hab blocks. When the doors open, the crowd explodes outward with the last reserves of their energy, desperate to reach their sleeping mats before complete collapse. Marak walks through the corridors toward Hab Unit 7 Delta 9, his feet moving automatically along a path he has traveled thousands of times. His mind is starting to work again now that the numbing routine of labor is ended, and with consciousness comes the full weight of what he has witnessed. Jack is dead, his friend burned alive while overseers prevented anyone from helping, while production continued around his dying body, while the machine that is the Imperium demonstrated once again that worker lives have no value beyond their productive capacity. The knowledge sits in Marak's chest like a stone, heavy and cold and permanent. He reaches his hab unit and palms the door control with a hand that shakes from exhaustion. The door slides open to reveal the same 2-meter by 2-meter space, the same darkness, the same heat. Vera is awake, her small form sitting on her sleeping mat in the corner, and when she sees him she smiles with the innocent joy of a 9-year-old sister seeing her brother return safely from work. The smile breaks something in Marak, cracks the numbness that has protected him for the past 9 hours, and suddenly he is crying. Not the silent tears he shed while working, but deep sobs that shake his entire body. Vera does not understand what has happened, but she crosses the small space and wraps her thin arms around him anyway, offering the only comfort available in their world, the simple presence of another human being who cares whether you live or die. Marek holds his sister and cries for his dead friend, and cries for all the workers who burn and break and die in service to a system that sees them as nothing more than components to be used and replaced. This is what it means to be poor in Warhammer 40K, where death is so common it becomes routine, where suffering is so constant it becomes normal, where the value of your life is measured entirely by your ability to turn a valve wheel exactly 47 times. Marek's tears eventually stop because the body can only cry for so long before exhaustion claims even grief. He releases Vera and wipes his face with hands that are blistered and raw from the valve wheel, leaving smears of industrial grime across his cheeks. His sister looks at him with eyes that are too knowing for a 9-year-old, eyes that have seen too much death and suffering to be shocked by her brother's breakdown. She does not ask what happened because she already knows in the general sense that matters. Someone died at the factorum. Someone always dies at the factorum. The specific details change, but the fundamental truth remains constant. The HAB unit is exactly as he left it this morning, which means it is exactly as it has been for his entire life. The same walls close enough to touch from the center of the room. The same sleeping mats that provide the only furniture. The same shelf that holds their meager possessions, a total of perhaps 15 items including ration cards, identification papers, 3 changes of work clothes, 2 drinking containers, and a small metal box that contains the few things they own that have no practical purpose. Marek crosses to the shelf and retrieves his drinking container, a battered metal cup that was issued to him on his 12th birthday when he began factorum work. The water inside is warm and tastes of chemicals, but he drinks it anyway because his body is desperately dehydrated from 16 hours of sweating in the refinery heat. His daily wages are deposited automatically onto his ration card, a sum calculated by the Imperium's labor administration to provide exactly enough purchasing power to keep a worker alive and functional. Today's wages total 3.2 throne gelt, which sounds like a number that should mean something until you understand what things cost in the lower hive. A single liter of clean water, not the recycled chemical mixture provided as basic ration, but actual clean water from processing plants that filter out most of the toxins, costs 0.8 throne gelt. A supplement pill that slows the progression of lung damage caused by breathing factorum air costs 1.1 throne gelt. Protection money paid to the gang that controls corridor access to his HAB block costs 0.5 throne gelt per day. The mathematics are simple and brutal. After paying for the things necessary to survive slightly longer, Marek has 0.8 throne gelt remaining, which is not enough to purchase actual food to supplement the corpse starch rations that are never quite enough to stop hunger. He makes the walk to the commerce level, a section of the HAB block where vendors sell goods to workers who have a few coins to spend. The commerce level operates in the red emergency lighting that illuminates all lower hive spaces, giving everything a hellish glow that seems appropriate for a place where desperate people trade their limited resources for things they need to survive. The vendors are workers themselves, people who have found ways to acquire goods through trade networks that exist outside official Imperial channels. They sell water that is slightly cleaner than ration water, food that is slightly more nutritious than corpse starch, medicine that might actually help with common worker ailments. Everything is overpriced because supply is limited and demand is desperate. But these vendors provide access to things that make survival slightly more bearable. Marek approaches a water vendor he has dealt with before, an old woman whose face is deeply lined from 60 years of breathing toxic air. She sells water that comes from illegal taps into the noble, district supply lines, water that has been purified to aristocratic standards before being stolen and redirected to the commerce levels. The theft is punishable by execution if discovered, but the profit margins make the risk worthwhile for those desperate enough to take it. Marek purchases 1 liter for 0.8 throne gelt, his entire remaining daily wage, and carries it back to his HAB unit like it is liquid gold. Because in the lower hive, clean water is more valuable than gold. Gold cannot keep you alive when your kidneys are failing from chemical exposure. He gives the water to Vera, watching as she drinks it slowly, savoring the taste of something that does not burn her throat or leave a chemical aftertaste. Her cough is worse today, the wet rattling sound that indicates fluid building in her lungs. Marek knows this sound because he heard it from his father for 6 months before his father collapsed and died. The lung damage that all Factorum workers suffer is progressive and irreversible. The toxic air destroys lung tissue one breath at a time, scar tissue building up until breathing becomes difficult, then painful, then impossible. Medical treatment exists that can slow this process, drugs that reduce inflammation and clear some of the chemical buildup, but these treatments cost 15 throne-geld per dose and must be taken daily to be effective. Marek's daily wage is 3.2 throne-geld. The mathematics make medical treatment impossible for workers, which means workers die of lung disease, which means their bodies become corpse starch, which means the system continues. Vera finishes the water and thanks him with a smile that makes the expense worthwhile. This is what love looks like in the lower hive, sacrificing your own needs to meet the needs of those you care about, giving what you cannot afford to give because watching your family suffer is worse than suffering yourself. Marek has not eaten anything except his morning corpse starch ration, which means he will go to sleep hungry tonight, which means he will wake up hungry tomorrow, which means his next shift will be even harder than today's. But Vera has clean water in her stomach, and maybe that will help her cough, and maybe helping her cough will give her a few more weeks or months before the lung damage becomes too severe to survive. Their mother returns as evening transitions into night, her own shift finally complete. She looks like a corpse already, her skin gray with exhaustion, her hands bleeding from cuts received while working the textile looms. She has been awake for 20 hours and has perhaps 3 hours to sleep before her next shift begins. There is no time for family conversation, no energy for the sharing of experiences or the expression of emotions. She drinks her water ration, eats her corpse starch, and collapses onto her sleeping mat without speaking a single word. This is normal. This is what family life looks like when every member works shifts that never align, when exhaustion makes communication impossible, when survival requires every scrap of energy and leaves nothing for human connection. Marek lies on his own sleeping mat but finds that sleep will not come despite his exhaustion. His mind keeps replaying the moment of the pipe rupture, the spray of chemical fire. Jack screams as he burned. The images are stuck in his head like a broken recording, playing over and over no matter how hard he tries to think of something else. This is trauma, the psychological wound that comes from witnessing horror, and it is as common among lower hive workers as lung damage and malnutrition. But there is no treatment for trauma. No counseling or therapy or time to process and heal. There is only the next shift and the shift after that and the endless repetition of labor that demands you function regardless of your mental state. He eventually gives up on sleep and sits up in the darkness, listening to his mother's exhausted breathing and Vera's wet cough. The hab unit feels smaller than usual tonight, the walls pressing in, the darkness absolute. He finds himself thinking about the alternatives to Factorum work. The other paths available to someone born into poverty in the lower hive. None of them are good. All of them end in death or worse. But his mind explores them anyway, cataloging the different flavors of suffering that define lower hive existence. The gangs are the most visible alternative. Groups of workers who have abandoned legitimate employment in favor of controlling territory and extracting tribute from those who still work. The gangs fight each other constantly over corridor access, water sources, and the right to collect protection money from specific hab blocks. Gang life offers the illusion of power and the reality of early violent death. Most gang members die before age 25, killed in territorial disputes or executed by enforcers during periodic purges that the Imperium conducts to maintain some minimal level of order. Marak knows gang members from his corridor, young men who swagger and threaten and collect their daily tribute with casual violence. They seem powerful until you realize they are just as trapped as everyone else, just dying in different ways. The Underhive offers another alternative, the vast spaces beneath the official hab blocks where the hive's infrastructure decays into ruins inhabited by those too desperate or too damaged to survive in the controlled areas above. The Underhive population consists of recidivists who scavenge ancient technology from collapsed sections. Mutants whose genetic damage makes them unemployable in the Factorum, and criminals fleeing imperial justice. Going to the Underhive means accepting a life of constant danger from unstable structures, toxic waste pools, and the things that hunt in the darkness. Mutants, feral servitors, creatures that were human once but have been changed by exposure to chemicals or radiation or the warp itself. The Underhive offers freedom from Factorum labor but replaces it with a struggle for survival that is even more desperate and even more likely to end in death. Some workers choose servitorization voluntarily, accepting the process of brain removal and mechanical augmentation in exchange for their families receiving extra rations or debt forgiveness. The servitor conversion process is advertised as a noble sacrifice, a way to serve the Emperor more perfectly by becoming a living machine. The reality is that servitorization destroys everything that makes you human, leaving only a biological robot that follows programmed instructions without thought or feeling or any awareness of what has been lost. Marak has seen volunteers for servitorization, desperate people who choose mechanical slavery over slow starvation, who trade their humanity for the promise that their children might eat slightly better. The choice makes a terrible kind of sense in a system where all options are horrific. Then there are the black market chirurgeons who buy body parts from living donors, paying enough that someone might survive a few extra months in exchange for a kidney or a section of liver or bone marrow that will be transplanted into wealthy patients who can afford such treatments. The chirurgeons operate in hidden surgical theaters where sanitation is minimal, and anesthesia is expensive, performing extractions that leave donors weakened and often infected. Many donors die from complications, but many more survive just long enough to spend their payment on food or water or medicine for family members. The body becomes a resource to be sold piece by piece until there is nothing left to harvest. Marak considers these alternatives and realizes that Factorum work, horrible as it is, represents one of the better options available to the poor. At least Factorum work provides regular rations and a place to sleep and the minimal protections that come from being part of the official imperial labor system. At least he has not yet been forced to choose between gang violence, Underhive scavenging, voluntary servitorization, or selling his organs. The realization is deeply depressing because it confirms what he has always known but tried not to think about. There is no escape from poverty in the lower hive. There is no path that leads upward through the hive levels toward better conditions and more opportunities. The system is designed to keep the poor trapped in poverty, extracting their labor until their bodies fail, then processing those bodies into food for the next generation of workers. The Imperium's doctrine explains this system as necessary and holy, as the proper order established by the Emperor himself. The preachers deliver sermons every rest day, their voices amplified through Vox systems that reach into every hab block and corridor. They speak of the glory of service and the nobility of suffering, of workers as the foundation of humanity's survival against the darkness that surrounds them. They teach that accepting your station is the highest virtue, that questioning the system is heresy, that poverty is a test of faith that the worthy endure with gratitude rather than resentment. The sermons are mandatory, enforced by enforcers who mark attendance and report those who fail to appear or who show insufficient enthusiasm during the prayers. Marak has listened to these sermons every rest day for 14 years, has absorbed the Imperium's teachings about hierarchy and duty and the divine right of the nobility to rule over those below them, He wants to believe because belief would make everything easier, would transform his suffering into sacred duty, would give meaning to the endless cycles of labor and deprivation. But tonight, lying in the darkness with his friend's screams still echoing in his memory, he finds that belief does not come. The doctrine promises that his suffering serves a purpose, but the purpose seems to be enriching nobles who live in towers he will never see, who consume luxuries purchased with his labor, who exist in such complete comfort that they do not even know he exists. He thinks about Lady Cassara from the reference script, the noble woman who lived in perfect ignorance of the suffering that sustained her existence until circumstances forced her to witness reality. He wonders if nobles ever think about where their wealth comes from, whether they consider the human cost of their comfort, whether they would care even if they knew. The question has no answer because nobles and workers exist in completely separate realities, divided by distances that cannot be crossed and barriers that cannot be breached. He will never meet a noble, never speak to someone from the upper spires, never have the opportunity to ask whether they know or care about the people whose suffering purchases their luxury. The rest day arrives after another brutal shift, 16 more hours of turning the valve wheel in heat that never decreases and air that never clears. Marak uses his rest hours to visit the commerce level again, this time seeking not water but information. There are vendors who deal in things other than physical goods, people who trade in news and rumors and forbidden knowledge. He finds one such vendor in a corner of the commerce level, an old man who sits surrounded by data slates and printed materials that he sells to workers willing to risk the attention of enforcers who monitor for seditious content. The old man recognizes Marak from previous visits and nods in greeting. His prices are higher than water vendors because information is more dangerous to sell than physical goods. Enforcers do not care if workers buy clean water, but they care very much if workers access materials that question imperial doctrine or suggest alternatives to the current system. The penalties for possessing seditious materials range from flogging to execution depending on the severity of the content and the mood of the enforcers who discover it. But workers still seek information because humans cannot help but wonder about alternatives, cannot stop themselves from imagining that things might be different, cannot entirely surrender the hope that change might be possible. Marak purchases a data slate for 2 throne gelt, 2/3 of his daily wage, money he should be spending on food or medicine for Vera. The slate contains text files that the vendor promises are worth the price, writings about worker organization and collective action and historical examples of populations that changed their circumstances through unity and resistance. The vendor wraps the slate in cloth and hands it over with a warning. Reading this material is dangerous. Possessing it is dangerous. Sharing it is a death sentence. But knowing what it contains might be valuable enough to justify the risk. Marak hides the slate in his work clothes and returns to his hab unit. He waits until his mother leaves for her shift, and Vera falls asleep, coughing wetly in her corner. Then he activates the slate, its screen glowing faintly in the darkness, and begins to read. The text speaks of things he has never considered, ideas that contradict everything the Imperium's doctrine teaches. It suggests that the current system is not divinely ordained but humanly constructed, not inevitable but chosen, not necessary but profitable for those who benefit from it. It describes historical instances of workers organizing to demand better conditions, collective actions that sometimes succeeded in forcing changes that improved lives even in the context of imperial rule. The ideas are revolutionary and terrifying and impossibly attractive. They suggest that change might be possible, that workers might have power if they acted together, that the system that seems eternal and unbreakable might actually be vulnerable to coordinated resistance. But they also acknowledge the costs of such action, the certainty of violent suppression, the likelihood that most participants in worker organizing would die horribly as examples to others. The text does not promise easy victory or guaranteed success. It simply presents information that the Imperium works hard to suppress, knowledge that asking for better treatment is not impossible even if it is dangerous. Marek reads until his eyes burn and his head aches from processing ideas that clash with everything he has been taught. The data slate offers no solutions, no clear path forward, no promise that action would succeed. It simply provides information and leaves the choice to the reader. He could delete the files and forget what he read, return to the comfortable numbness of accepting his situation as unchangeable. Or he could keep the slate, continue reading, perhaps share the information with other workers who might be interested. The choice feels enormous, even though any action he takes will be small and probably meaningless in the context of a hive city with billions of inhabitants and an imperial system that spans the galaxy. He hides the slate in the wall of the hab unit, wedging it into a gap behind the shelf where it cannot be seen during casual inspection. The possession of this information changes nothing about his immediate situation. He will still wake to the shift bell tomorrow, still turn the valve wheel for 16 hours, still watch his sister's cough worsen and his mother work herself to death. But knowing that alternatives have been imagined, that resistance has been attempted, that the system is not truly eternal, plants a seed of something in his mind. Not hope exactly, because hope requires believing that good outcomes are possible. But perhaps awareness. The recognition that his suffering is not natural or inevitable, but the result of choices made by people who could choose differently. The data slate sits in the wall, hidden but present, containing knowledge that is dangerous to possess but impossible to unknow. Marek lies on his sleeping mat listening to Vera's cough and his mother's exhausted breathing, his mind churning with thoughts that will not quiet. He is still trapped in poverty, still powerless to change his circumstances, still likely to die young from industrial accidents or lung disease or simple exhaustion. But he knows now that his situation is not the result of divine will or natural law, but of human systems that serve some humans while consuming others. The knowledge will not save him, but it prevents him from accepting his suffering as righteous or necessary or deserved. And that small shift in understanding, that tiny crack in the perfect shell of imperial indoctrination, represents the beginning of something that might eventually matter even if it changes nothing about tomorrow's shift. The shift bell rings 3 days later, and Marek wakes to news that spreads through the corridors like fire through promethium vapor. The rations are being cut again, the 5th reduction this year, announced through Vox speakers that blast the message into every hab block with mechanical repetition. The Imperium's Factorum administration has determined that current ration allocations exceed minimum nutritional requirements by a small margin, and this excess will be redirected to support the construction of a new cathedral in the noble districts. The cathedral will glorify the emperor and demonstrate the piety of the ruling families. The workers should be grateful that their small sacrifice contributes to such a worthy purpose. The mathematics of the reduction are precise and cruel. Daily food rations will decrease from 3 corpse starch bars to 2.5 bars. Daily water rations will decrease from 1.7 liters to 1.4 liters. The cuts represent a 16% reduction in already insufficient allocations, a decrease that will push workers who are already malnourished closer to starvation, that will kill the weakest and oldest within weeks, that will make survival even more desperate for everyone else. The announcement includes stern warnings about accepting this change with proper gratitude and faithful obedience. Any worker who complains or protests will be noted for attitude adjustment, which is the Imperium's polite term for torture, re-education, or execution depending on the severity of the offense. Marek listens to the announcement while pulling on his work clothes, his mind calculating what the reduction means for his family. His mother is already operating at the edge of physical collapse, her body consuming itself to fuel the endless shifts at the textile mills. The reduction will push her past that edge within a month, maybe less. Vera's cough requires nutrition to fight, her damaged lungs burning calories trying to clear fluid that will not clear. The reduction will accelerate her decline, turn months of remaining life into weeks. And Marek himself is 14 years old and still growing, his body demanding food to build muscle and bone while the factorum demands labor that destroys both. The reduction will stunt his growth permanently, weaken his body faster, shorten his already brief expected lifespan. The corridors are different this morning as workers make their way toward the transit lifts. Instead of the usual exhausted silence, there are voices raised in anger and fear. Workers speaking to each other in violation of the unwritten rules that say you do not complain, you do not question, you do not acknowledge that the system is killing you. The anger is raw and genuine because this reduction crosses a line that even desperate people recognize. You can survive on insufficient rations by supplementing with purchased food if you have money. But when rations are cut and prices remain the same, when your wages barely cover current costs and new costs are added, survival becomes mathematically impossible rather than merely difficult. A woman shouts that her children are already starving, that cutting rations will kill them, that she cannot work if her children are dead. An old man argues that workers who built the Imperium for 60 years deserve better than to be starved to fund noble vanity projects. A young worker demands to know why nobles need cathedrals when workers need food, why aristocratic piety matters more than human lives. The voices multiply and overlap until the corridor fills with anger that has been suppressed for years, rage that has been building under the surface of enforced compliance, desperation that finally finds expression in collective outcry. The enforcers arrive quickly, their shock mauls crackling with energy, their voices amplified through helmet speakers to boom commands over the growing noise. Return to your stations, cease unauthorized communication, resume standard behavior patterns. But the crowd does not disperse as it normally would, does not fall silent and shuffle toward the lifts in obedient compliance. The anger is too strong this morning, the fear too urgent, the sense of injustice too powerful to be suppressed by the usual threats. Someone throws a piece of debris at an enforcer and suddenly the corridor explodes into violence. Workers surge toward the enforcers with improvised weapons, with bare hands, with the fury of people who have nothing left to lose. The enforcers respond with shock mauls and stub guns, beating and shooting into the crowd with the mechanical efficiency of people trained to suppress resistance. Bodies fall, bleeding and twitching, trampled by the press of workers pushing forward. The violence spreads through the corridor like a disease, workers attacking enforcers and each other in the confusion, years of suppressed rage erupting into mindless destruction. This is not organized resistance or planned rebellion. This is spontaneous riot, the explosion that happens when pressure builds beyond what human beings can endure. Marek finds himself swept up in the surge of bodies, pushed forward by the crowd behind him, unable to escape the violence that fills the corridor. He sees an enforcer go down under a mass of workers who beat him with pieces of metal torn from wall panels. He sees a woman shot in the chest, her body falling to be trampled by those who cannot stop moving. He sees workers fighting each other for reasons that make no sense, the violence spreading beyond any rational target to become pure chaos. The noise is overwhelming, screams and shouts and the crack of gunfire and the wet sounds of impact as shock mauls break bones and crush skulls. He manages to push sideways, fighting against the flow of the crowd, desperate to reach a side corridor that might offer escape from the violence. His shoulder slams into other workers, his feet slip in blood that covers the floor. His lungs burn from breathing air thick with the smell of fear and death. He reaches the side corridor and runs, leaving behind the riot that will certainly end in mass casualties, that will bring enforcer reinforcements and brutal suppression, that will result in executions designed to terrify the survivors into renewed obedience. The factorum is chaos when he arrives, the riot spreading through multiple sectors as news of the ration cuts reaches workers across the hive. In some sections, workers have stopped production entirely, walking away from their stations in violation of every rule that governs their existence. In others, workers are destroying equipment, sabotaging machinery that represents the Imperium's wealth extraction system. The overseers have retreated to their elevated platforms, calling for enforcer support, their shock malls inadequate to control riots that involve thousands of workers acting in uncoordinated but collective defiance. Marak reaches his valve station and finds the area empty, the workers who normally operate the surrounding equipment gone or hiding or dead in the corridors. The Prometheum lines hiss with pressure. The machinery continues its automatic operations, but no human hands guide the production. He stands before his valve wheel, uncertain what to do. Every instinct trained into him over 2 years of factorum work says to begin turning the wheel, to perform his assigned function, to maintain the compliance that keeps him alive. But the anger that fills the factorum is infectious, and he finds himself wondering why he should turn the wheel while other workers fight and die, why he should maintain production that enriches nobles who are starving his family, why he should cooperate with a system that views his life as having no value beyond labor extraction. The decision is made for him when the enforcer assault begins. Teams of armored enforcers storm the factorum floor, their weapons loaded with live ammunition rather than the shock rounds normally used for crowd control. The message is clear. This riot will end with maximum brutality, with body counts designed to terrify survivors, with violence so overwhelming that it destroys any thought of future resistance. The Hive Governor's decree came through Vox speakers minutes after the riot began. Decimation protocol authorized for Sector Gamma, enforcers to implement immediately. The enforcers do not distinguish between workers who participated in the riot and those who did not. They simply shoot every 10th worker they encounter, the ancient Roman punishment that the Imperium uses when collective discipline is deemed necessary. Marak watches from his station as enforcers work their way through Section 5, counting workers and executing every 10th person with a shot to the head. The victims are chosen by number, not action, guilty of nothing except being in the wrong position when the count reached 10. A woman who was trying to hide, a man who was attempting to return to his station, a boy younger than Marak who was frozen in terror. Every 10th person dies regardless of their individual choices. Because the Imperium punishes populations, not individuals. Because collective guilt is easier to enforce than individual justice. Because terror works best when it is random enough that everyone fears they might be next. The enforcers reach Section 6, Marak's section, and begin their count. 1, 2, 3. Workers who remained at their stations are counted the same as workers who rioted. 4, 5, 6. Compliance offers no protection because the punishment is collective. 7, 8, 9. Marak is number 9, and the worker standing 3 meters to his left is number 10. The enforcer raises his weapon and fires, and the worker's head explodes in a spray of blood and brain matter that splatters across Marak's face and clothes. Number 10 is dead. Counting begins again from 1. The killing continues for hours, enforcers systematically working through every section of the factorum, executing every 10th worker until the floors are slick with blood and the air reeks of death. 3,000 workers die in Sector Gamma alone, their bodies dragged away by servitors and processed into the same corpse starch that survivors will eat tomorrow. The riot is suppressed with overwhelming violence, the brief explosion of resistance crushed under the weight of imperial power, the workers reminded in the most brutal possible way that defiance results in death. Marak survives because mathematics placed him at position 9 instead of position 10, because random chance saved his life while condemning others, because survival in the lower hive is always a matter of luck rather than deserving. He returns to his valve wheel with blood on his face and the image of the executed worker burned into his memory. Another trauma to add to the collection that will haunt him for whatever remains of his life. His hands find the wheel and begin to turn. 1, 2, 3. The counting continues because the counting always continues. 45, 46, 47. Production resumes because production always resumes. The Imperium's response to the riot extends beyond immediate executions. Over the following days, new control measures are implemented throughout the lower hive. Surveillance systems are expanded, monitoring every corridor and hab block for signs of seditious communication. Ration distribution is modified to include loyalty screenings, workers required to demonstrate proper attitudes before receiving their reduced allocations. Enforcers conduct random searches of hab units, looking for contraband materials or evidence of unauthorized organizing. The searches are brutal and thorough, destroying what little privacy workers possess, violating the minimal dignity that made their existence barely tolerable. Marek lives in constant fear that the searches will discover the data slate hidden in his wall, that possession of seditious materials will result in his execution, and probably his family's execution as well. He considers destroying the slate, deleting the files and smashing the device to eliminate the evidence. But something stops him, some stubborn refusal to surrender the knowledge he gained, some recognition that destroying information serves the system that oppresses him. He leaves the slate hidden and hopes that luck will spare him as it spared him during the decimation. His mother returns from her shift one evening with news that breaks what remains of his heart. Vera has been denied rations because her productivity has fallen below acceptable levels. The cough has progressed to the point where she can barely breathe, cannot work the required shifts, fails to meet the quotas that justify her continued existence in the Imperium's calculations. Without rations, she has perhaps 2 weeks to live, maybe less. The Imperium does not execute her directly, does not waste ammunition on someone who is dying anyway. It simply withdraws support and allows nature to take its course, death by administrative decision rather than direct violence. Marek looks at his sister, at her thin body racked by coughing fits, at her eyes that show awareness of what the ration denial means. She is 9 years old and she knows she is going to die, knows that the system has decided her life is over, knows that her brother and mother cannot save her because they barely have enough resources to save themselves. The knowledge is visible in her face, acceptance mixed with fear, mixed with the terrible sadness of a child who will never grow up, never experience the things that make life worth living, never have the chance to be anything except another statistic in the endless casualty count of lower hive existence. He makes a decision that night, alone in the darkness while his mother and sister sleep. He retrieves the data slate from its hiding place and reads through the files again, this time looking for specific information about worker organizing, about collective action, about the methods that have historically been used to demand better treatment. The files speak of underground networks that pass information between workers, of coordinated work stoppages that disrupt production enough to force negotiations, of protests that sometimes succeed in drawing attention to intolerable conditions. They also speak honestly about the costs, about organizers who die under torture, about movements crushed by overwhelming force, about the high probability that resistance ends in failure and death. Marek does not have illusions about changing the Imperium or overthrowing the system or winning some great victory against impossible odds. He is 14 years old and realistic enough to know that individual workers have no power against the vast machinery of imperial control. But he also knows that doing nothing means watching Vera die, means accepting that the ration cuts will continue until everyone he cares about is dead, means surrendering to a system that views him as less valuable than the metal of the valve wheel he turns every day. The choice is not between success and failure, but between trying and accepting, between resistance and submission, between dying on his feet or dying on his knees. He begins to speak quietly with other workers during the brief rest periods that production schedules allow. Careful conversations that test whether others share his anger, whether anyone else has thought about organizing, whether collective action might be possible. The responses are mixed. Some workers are too afraid to even discuss such ideas. the recent decimation having destroyed their willingness to risk anything. Others are interested but cautious, willing to listen but unwilling to commit to action that might result in their execution. A few are angry enough to consider resistance despite the obvious dangers, desperate enough to embrace risk because their current trajectory leads to death anyway. The network grows slowly over weeks, careful connections between workers who share information and ideas while maintaining the appearance of normal compliance. They do not plan revolution or dream of overthrowing the nobility or imagine transforming the Imperium into something just. Their goals are modest and specific: force negotiations about the ration cuts, demand minimal safety improvements in the factorums, request that workers who become too sick to work receive some support rather than being left to die. These are not radical demands. They are requests for treatment that recognizes workers as human beings rather than expendable components. Marek returns to his hab unit each day to find Vera weaker, her body consuming itself without adequate nutrition, her cough producing blood that stains the cloth she uses to cover her mouth. His mother works longer shifts trying to earn enough to purchase food for Vera. But the mathematics remain impossible, and exhaustion is killing her faster than the extra wages help. The knowledge that his sister is dying drives Marek to take risks he would otherwise avoid, to push the organizing network harder than is probably safe, to believe that action must be taken now because waiting means losing everything that matters. The data slate remains hidden in the wall, containing information that has become both more valuable and more dangerous as the organizing network expands. Marek reads the files repeatedly, learning from historical examples, understanding the patterns that determine whether resistance succeeds or fails. He does not expect success. He expects death, probably painful and certainly public, designed to serve as warning to others who might consider defiance. But he also expects that trying is better than surrendering, that fighting is more human than accepting, that choosing his own death is more dignified than allowing the system to kill him passively through starvation and exhaustion and industrial accidents. The shift bell rings as it always does, and Marek wakes in darkness to begin another day of turning the valve wheel exactly 47 times. His hands are permanently blistered now, the skin thick with calluses that crack and bleed. His lungs are scarred with black deposits that make breathing difficult. His body is thinner than it should be, muscle consumed to fuel labor that the inadequate rations cannot support. He is 14 years old and already dying, already marked by the conditions that will kill him before he reaches 30, already committed to a trajectory that ends in corpse starch and anonymous death. But he is also connected to a network of workers who share his anger, who have read the same information, who are considering the same desperate choices. He does not know if their plans will succeed or even if they will be attempted. He does not know if he will live long enough to see Vera die or whether he will die first trying to change the system that is killing her. He does not know anything except that the current situation is intolerable, and that tolerating it without resistance means surrendering his humanity along with his life. This is what it means to be poor in Warhammer 40K. Not poverty as temporary condition, but poverty as eternal state, designed by those above, endured by those below, blessed by a religion that transforms oppression into righteousness. Marek will work until injury, illness, or age makes him useless, or until resistance results in his execution. Then he will become the corpse's starch that feeds tomorrow's workers. This is not a failure of the system. This is the system working exactly as intended. 17 billion souls on this world alone live this same existence, their suffering invisible to those it enriches, their lives measured only in production quotas, their deaths mourned by no one but each other. Marek's hands close around the valve wheel and begin to turn, the motion automatic, the counting familiar. 1, 2, 3. But now the counting means something different, not merely mechanical compliance, but measured time until the moment when choice becomes action, when anger becomes resistance, when the poor decide that dying while fighting is better than dying while surrendering. 45, 46, 47. The wheel turns, the promethium flows, the machine continues. But somewhere in the darkness of Hab Block 7 Delta 9, a data slate waits with information that the Imperium works to suppress, and a network of workers grows stronger despite the fear that should keep them compliant, and a 14-year-old boy makes choices that might mean nothing or might mean everything. The shift continues into its second hour, and Marak turns the wheel, and somewhere above him nobles eat meals that cost more than his life is worth. And the distance between their paradise and his hell remains unmeasured and uncrossed, a chasm maintained by violence and ignorance and the simple human capacity to ignore suffering that does not touch you directly. This is the life of the poor in Warhammer 40K, where hope is dangerous and resistance is fatal and survival requires becoming less human every day. And yet humans persist, and anger builds, and even in the darkest hive depths, the possibility of change whispers like sedition in the shadows.